I am LaShawn Warren, Vice President of Policy Development and Programming at the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy. For those of you who are not familiar with ACS, we are a national network of lawyers, law students, judges, and policymakers who believe that the law should be a force to improve the lives of all people. And to that end, we work for positive change by shaping the debate on vitally important legal and constitutional questions. And it is our mission to ensure the fundamental principles of human dignity and individual rights and liberties. And we work to ensure that they have their rightful place in American law. National security policy implicates many of these concerns. Further, it requires a delicate balance of providing security and respecting liberty. As the Department of Homeland Security marks its 10th anniversary, we are excited to partner with the Open Society Foundations to discuss the department's successes and failures in this regard, and to consider the department's future. To speak more about this program, I am pleased to introduce my colleague, Deepal Shah, who is the Director of Policy Development and Programming, and as a part of his portfolio, he handles national security policy for ACS. Thank you.
Thank you, LaShawn, Open Society Foundations, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. I just want to make a few housekeeping announcements. First off, this is an office setting, and so if you need to make a cell phone a call or if you need to have a conversation, please use the lounge or the area by the elevators. Additionally, if you do have a cell phone with you, please silence it before we get started today. Restrooms can be found through the hallway, and you will see a sign that says restrooms. This past weekend, like many of you, I waited in line at airport security. Removed my shoes, put my toiletries in a tray. Overhead, I heard announcements concerning our current threat level. And then minutes later, as I sat at my gate waiting for my flight, I watched as TV screens flickered with images of cleanup from Hurricane Sandy, the debate over cybersecurity, and stories of immigration. All around me, the sounds and sights of our Department of Homeland Security at play. On Sunday, the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, marked its 10-year anniversary. As part of the largest government reorganization in decades, 22 separate government agencies were brought under the umbrella of Homeland Security, from Immigration and Customs to TSA and FEMA. The primary goal of DHS has always been to keep America safe. So are we safer today? Some have proposed that one thing that matters when evaluating DHS performance is its success preventing any domestic terrorist attacks on the scale of 9/11. By that metric, DHS has been largely successful. By expanding our intelligence and information sharing capabilities, many assert DHS has made it harder to plan and coordinate such an attack, has secured potential terrorist targets, trained local authorities and personnel, and has kept a watchful eye on terrorist threats in the future. But these gains in security have come at what others consider great costs. With over 200,000 employees, it has emerged as the third largest cabinet department. By some estimates, over $1 trillion has been spent on domestic homeland security in the past decade. Moreover, some argue that there are additional costs in DHS activities, those that are paid through an impact on our civil liberties. Heading into President Obama's second term, DHS plays a pivotal role in our country's often contentious immigration policy. DHS will be at the forefront of our domestic cybersecurity initiative, an area that appears more and more central in our modern and global era of technology and information exchange. And as we continue to watch the Northeast rebuild after Hurricane Sandy, we are reminded that it is DHS that takes the lead on federal emergency management and response. As Congress seeks to better oversee DHS activities, it is clear that DHS has a number of wide-ranging responsibilities. Today, we hope to discuss DHS accomplishments and successes, failures and areas for improvement, and look prospectively to the work DHS will engage in during its next decade. And now I turn your attention to our panel of experts who you understandably would rather hear from. To facilitate and moderate this discussion, I am pleased to introduce Stephen Vladek. He is Professor of Law and the Associate Dean for Scholarship at American University Washington College of Law, and is a recognized expert in the realm of national security law and counterterrorism. He is a senior editor of the Journal of National Security Law and Policy, a senior contributor to the Lawfare blog, and has been on a number of legal teams challenging the U.S. government's surveillance and detention of terrorism suspects. I will now turn things over to Professor Vladek to introduce our panel.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Thank you all for coming today. It's a real treat to have you here. Is that on? Oh, now it's on. I see a light, and I assume it's on. If it's a red light, it would make sense that it wouldn't be on. All right. Anyway, thanks to Paul for the introduction. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Open Society Foundation for hosting this, to ACS for co-hosting this. I'm going to actually just sort of be very brief in my opening comments, since Paul already mentioned the motivation for today's panel. Let me just briefly describe our format. I'm going to introduce our four speakers, and then they're going to give basically very short opening remarks. Not necessarily sort of a seriatim presentation mode, but just to get the ball rolling on some of the key issues that the Department of Homeland Security has grappled with over the past 10 years, that the department will be grappling with going forward, and then we'll move from there into more of a back and forth discussion with plenty of time at the end for your questions and answers. So with that, let me just briefly introduce our speakers. You have much more detailed information on them in your handouts. Starting all the way at the far end of the table is Mike German. Mike is the Senior Policy Counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union. To Mike's right is Wendy Patton. Wendy's a Senior Policy Analyst here at Open Society Foundations. To Wendy's right is Seth Grossman. He's the Deputy General Counsel at the Department of Homeland Security. And last but certainly not least, to Seth's right, my left, is Jamil Jaffer, who's a Senior Counsel at the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. So we're going to start with Mike's opening remarks, and then we'll move down the line, and then we'll open it up for more discussion. So, Mike.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to ACS and OSI for inviting me and hosting this event. I was designated to talk about DHS intelligence operations and then also to briefly mention TSA in how it's related to that. The DHS's creation, sort of created an initiative to do some intelligence work, since it's Homeland Security, in an environment that was already full of intelligence agencies. The FBI, obviously state and local law enforcement was involved in this activity long before there was DHS. So I think they've struggled to try to carve out an area where they can be helpful. And rather than sort of taking time developing a strategic idea of what they wanted to accomplish, like many of the things DHS has done, they rushed right in with an imperative that seemed to be do something rather than an imperative of do something effective. And the primary method that the DHS created was its support and development of state and local law enforcement intelligence fusion centers. And the ACLU started raising concerns about the rapid development of these centers. When we issued a report in 2007, I think there were somewhere around 49 centers. Now there are over 77 that DHS recognizes. Although Senate Homeland Security Investigation Subcommittee just issued a report that even some of the fusion centers that DHS funds don't actually exist. So the bottom line of their report was, one, how difficult it was to determine how much DHS resources were actually going into this initiative, and they were able to get it down to an estimate of somewhere between $289 million and $1.4 billion. So with that scope in what's being spent, that's a huge part of the problem. But even worse, I'll quote from the report, the subcommittee's 2-year investigation found that DHS's support of fusion centers has yielded little, if any, benefit to federal counterterrorism intelligence efforts. After reviewing 13 months' worth of reporting originating from fusion centers from 2009 to 2010, the subcommittee investigation found that DHS assigned detailees to the centers forwarded intelligence of uneven quality, often shoddy, rarely timely, sometimes endangering citizen civil liberties and Privacy Act protections, occasionally taken from already published public sources, and more often than not unrelated to terrorism. So we have this huge expenditure, this threat to civil liberties that's created with very little benefit. One of the methodologies that DHS has promoted and encouraged the fusion centers to get involved in is suspicious activity reporting, which sounds good on its face. Of course, if we see somebody out in the public engaged in some sort of activity that indicates there might be some harm they're planning to somebody, we want the public and police officers to respond to that. The problem with these programs is the way they've described what is suspicious, and one of the activities is note-taking. So I'm sorry, but there are a couple of people here that we're going to have to report for that. Sorry about that. And other innocuous activities that sort of take away the idea that this activity is really suspicious. And our concern was that it would provide the opportunity for bias policing, whether based on race or somebody's political beliefs or activities, where the behaviors are so innocuous that it's not reporting behavior that's suspicious, but reporting behavior by people you're already suspicious of because of your bias. And sure enough, the George Washington University Homeland Security Policy Institute recently did a survey of fusion centers, and responding to the survey, fusion centers personnel criticized this program. In fact, what the report says was that suspicious activity reporting system has proven to be more of a passive collection mechanism based on observed behavior reasonably indicative of pre-operational planning related to terrorism or other criminal activity. Well, this is certainly a good baseline for depicting anomalies, and while institutionalizing this type of reporting within police departments in their respective communities has improved collection, it has flooded fusion centers, law enforcement, and other security entities with white noise. This white noise complicates the intelligence process and distorts resource allocation and deployment decisions. So, here we have a lot of funds, a lot of resources, a lot of energy being put into programs that nobody has ever evaluated for whether these are actually effective in addressing the threats that face our nation. And that's, I think, a big part of the problem. And moving quickly over to TSA, they engage in sort of the same behavior where they push forward with an idea without evaluating whether it's an effective methodology. And we saw that most perniciously right after the underpants bombing attempt, that rather than looking at the problem and evaluating the threat and what to do about it, they rushed forward putting out these naked body scanners that had a huge privacy impact without really providing much of a security benefit. And similarly, they've done that with this behavioral detection, which is very similar to the suspicious activity reporting, that it uses behaviors that aren't in and of themselves suspicious, and is really just a proxy for racial profiling. So I see the stop sign, so sorry.
Great. Thanks, Mike. So that gets the ball rolling on fusion centers on TSA. When did you want to pick it up, maybe with Homeland Security and immigration?
Yes. I also just want to say thank you to ACS for partnering. There we go. Yep, I was confused by the lights too, and I shouldn't be since I work here. But I do want to say thank you.
I at least had an excuse.
I just want to say thank you to our colleagues at ACS for partnering with us in hosting this discussion about DHS at its 10th anniversary. And as Steve said, I'm going to say a few words about immigration and what the transfer to DHS has meant for immigration policy. I think, as most folks know, the former, or as it's now called, legacy INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, was previously housed at the Department of Justice. With the creation of DHS, INS was dismantled and its functions were transferred over to DHS. Only the Executive Office of Immigration Review, which is the immigration courts, remain over at the Department of Justice. And when the INS came over to DHS, it was split into separate entities. So we have the main ones are ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, USCIS, which is U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and then also CBP, which is Customs and Border Protection. Now, one of the ideas that was around before 9/11 for reform of the INS was the idea of splitting up services and enforcement. And the idea was that we might get better focus in each area if there was a sort of separate focus or structure around each of those. And that you see played out in the way that the entities were separated within DHS. And what I want to speak to a little bit is what were some of the initial concerns that people had about this transfer of moving INS over to DHS. during the time that the legislation to create DHS was being debated in 2002. The idea of creating a security agency was gathering steam in 2002, and it became clear that immigration would be placed under DHS. And as a result, there were many in civil society and in the advocacy community who were worried about the direction that that kind of structural reform might take and what it would mean for immigration policy. I was working on the issue at the time with a number of others in the civil and human rights community and in the immigrant advocacy community on the bill in 2002. And there was concern about locating immigration under the rubric of Homeland Security, which, if you recall, was then a new and somewhat uncertain term in our public policy discourse. Many were worried that this move would take all that immigration has meant to our country throughout our history and collapse it into a very narrow security frame. And there were also concerns about vulnerable groups of immigrants in particular, refugees, asylum seekers, unaccompanied minor children, victims of domestic violence, among others. How would a new Department of Homeland Security address the humanitarian issues that are present in so many immigration matters? But I think what I can say about where we are 10 years later is that the biggest impact on immigration policy that we've seen since that time really is not so much the transfer to DHS, but it's 9/11 and its aftermath. The transfer to DHS, of course, is a hugely significant factor, but it's the 9/11 context that has exerted the greatest influence on the immigration arena, resulting in a central focus on national security and counterterrorism. We have seen intense focus on border security and on the use of immigration as a counterterrorism tool, which I'm happy to talk more about later, but I think notably examples of that would be the misguided detention policies that were put in place in the aftermath of 9/11 and the dramatic expansion of security-related enforcement programs, particularly those where the federal government involves state and local government in immigration enforcement and information collection. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. Seth, you want to jump in from there, maybe talk about from the inside how things have gone and what you see as some of the big issues going forward?
Sure. DHS, as I think everyone recognizes, is a very large organization. It's the third largest cabinet department. As was mentioned, it brought together 22 separate agencies. And it's relatively new. It's 10 years old, but as cabinet departments go, that's very recent. And so when this administration came to office in January of 2009, it inherited an agency that a lot of really great work had done to set it up, but it was still new and we were learning lessons about how to conduct programs, how to organize the agency, how to work together internally in DHS, and how to work with our interagency partners across the federal government, state governments, and local governments. And I think one thing that has sort of characterized this administration's approach to the various functions that fall under DHS is trying to move away from sort of one-size-fits-all solutions and trying to get to sort of common sense, targeted, prioritized approaches. You can see this in a few different areas. On the border, especially the southwest border, when this administration came to office, there was a lot of focus on sort of global solutions. Let's build a fence for the entire border. Let's just have one solution that works for everywhere. But as anyone who's been on the southwest border knows, the terrain, sort of the population density, various things across the border are very different depending on where you are at the border. And so this administration moved to a more targeted approach where we deploy different kinds of personnel, technology, and other resources depending on what made sense for that area of the border. And in our view, the results have been very strong. In our view, border security is at its highest level it's been in over 50 years. And you can see this in other ways also. In TSA, we're trying to move more to risk-based screening. So we have the pre-check program, which some of you may have experienced, where if you undergo pre-registration and screening, you can go through reduced screening when you're at the airport. And these kind of moving to risk-based screening, I think will have a very positive effect on TSA and other things going forward. And I think you can see it most notably, or perhaps most clearly, in the immigration context, where when this administration came to office, there wasn't a lot of priorities in how immigration resources were used, coming in at a time when the
immigration infrastructure had been increased dramatically in the years from like 2005, 2006, and 2007 in terms of the budget of ICE and the other immigration agencies. And so what this administration did is try to apply common sense priorities, saying, we don't have enough resources to remove every person who's here unlawfully, even if that's what we wanted to do. And so it made sense to focus those resources on people we thought should be priorities for removal in a world of finite resources. So people who have been convicted of crimes or national security threats, people who had recently crossed the border, and people who had repeatedly violated immigration laws. And we set those priorities early on in the administration, and since then, we've built various programs to implement them across the immigration enforcement system. We undertook, for instance, a case-by-case review of all cases that have been pending in immigration court, because many cases, I think people familiar with immigration, I know I'm sure Wendy can speak to, have penned in immigration court for years. And so a lot of cases had gotten into the system before there were priorities. And so in order to allow the system to focus on high priorities, we undertook a review to identify cases that were low priorities or not priorities for enforcement and remove those from the system. We've adopted other administrative reforms to help focus the apparatus on high priority cases, partially by removing low priority cases from the system, most notably through the new program for deferred action for childhood arrivals, where individuals who came to the United States when they were young and meet various other guidelines can request consideration to have their case deferred, and so we can take those cases out of the system to allow the system to focus on high priority cases. And so I think this is sort of characteristic of the approach the department's taken across various things. When we've reformed FEMA, we've reformed CBP, when we've reformed various other things. There's obviously a lot more work to do. An organization as new and large as DHS, there's always more work to do. As the Secretary says, we can always improve any program, but I think we've done a lot of work in the 4 years we've been here to sort of improve the focus of the programs so that they make sense and that they're smart.
Great. Thank you, Seth. And Jamil, I guess last but not least, what's your perspective, the view from the Hill? What do you think some of the biggest are, maybe from an oversight and also cyber perspective?
Sure. So, as you all know, the issue of cybersecurity is one that's been widely debated in recent months and over the past year, both on Capitol Hill and within the administration. And one of the big topics is how can we best achieve a collaboration between the government and the private sector to better improve the private sector cybersecurity. The Bush administration in 2008 it promulgated the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative. Portions of it were declassified by the Obama administration. And one of the key points there was that DHS would have the lead role in both federal government cybersecurity as well as working with the private sector to better improve the private sector cybersecurity. Since then, Congress has sought to take some action to help move that process forward. In the House passed a cybersecurity information sharing legislation, as well as 3 other pieces of cybersecurity legislation by large bipartisan margins. The Senate had a little bit more of a challenge. It took up the issue comprehensively in a single bill and ran into a challenge in the debate between regulation and not regulation of cybersecurity, and that largely stalled the debate in the Senate. So as of now, no bill has made it through Congress, unfortunately, and the administration is now considering an executive order to at least try to move the ball down the road on cybersecurity within the limitations that it has. And one of the debates, though, on Capitol Hill about cybersecurity has been, who's best placed to do this mission, right? And it was one that the Bush administration decided with respect to the private sector and the government in favor of DHS, and one the Obama administration has maintained the same view on. It remains controversial on Capitol Hill, however, in the question of whether DHS has the capabilities to handle the mission, to take it on in an expedited manner, and to roll it out quickly. And so, particularly in the context of the efforts that the Department of Defense has made with the defense industrial base to work with them in a collaborative manner to help improve their security in the first instance, and then the question of how you roll that out further to the rest of the private sector. DHS has now taken on the lead role under the administration's policies for expanding what was known as the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base Pilot Program, to a broader group of private sector agencies and private sector entities. And so it's sort of to be seen what happens and how that works. We have seen some challenges as that program has moved from DoD to DHS. We've seen some losses in terms of companies participating. And there's a debate about what caused that. Was it because the way the provider mix changed, or because the companies didn't want to participate anymore, or because of the change in who was running it. But the real question, I think, on the Hill is, if we're going to move this process forward and rapidly expand the government's cybersecurity efforts and the work with the private sector to improve the private sector's own cybersecurity, can DHS take that mission on, and can it handle it, and can it roll it out in a quick, efficient manner? And that remains an open question, a matter for oversight for Congress, and a matter for DHS to sort of take a hold of and move forward on. So it's an issue we continue to talk about and discuss on Capitol Hill. It's an issue we work collaboratively with the administration to address. And I think it's one that will continue to be an open issue. And I think we're hopeful on Capitol Hill that we will be able to find a middle ground consensus on cybersecurity legislation. The administration understands that there are things that simply can't be done through executive order. And we're hoping that we'll be able to work collaboratively and find a process that will move the ball forward on cybersecurity.
Great. I mean, so I guess we get the sense, I think, already just from the range of topics covered in those four very brief but very helpful statements, just how much DHS is in charge of, right? How much it's responsible for. And I guess my first question to sort of get a discussion going is there a theme that actually links together these responsibilities? I mean, Mike, in your comments, you suggested, part of the problem is that there's sort of no underlying mission, right? That it's just sort of go look like you're doing something. And I guess the question is there a way, is one of the critiques of the proposal back in 2002 was that you're putting together a whole lot of different agencies that had different responsibilities, didn't really speak the same language. Is that still a problem? Have we made progress? Is this still sort of 22 agencies in search of an idea? How would we begin to assess that?
So I think that the problems that exist in the DHS foray into intelligence collection and analysis exist without DHS. If we look at the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, we will find the exact same problems. If we look at state and local law enforcement intelligence, we find the exact same problems before they started receiving these federal funds. So, I don't think that the issues are new. And to the extent that DHS is stumbling, they're stumbling along with everyone else. And I think Wendy was exactly right that a lot of this isn't DHS oriented as much as post 9/11. And if you look at a lot of the counterterrorism programs, from the Patriot Act, through the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act amendments, there's a lot of let's just put something on the books and no analysis of whether this is actually doing anything to improve our security. On the one hand, the Senate report on fusion centers was extremely critical of DHS, rightfully so, but I think there was some good that DHS can pull out of it because they got criticized for a report on right-wing anti-government militias. They put in place a program that would evaluate their fusion center reports that they were putting out, and that process identified a lot of reports that were problematic from a privacy and civil liberties standpoint, and to their credit, those were not published. So, to the extent that they could turn this initiative into something broader, because, what the report shows is that DHS is stopping bad DHS reports from getting out. But the whole purpose of the fusion centers is that you have multiple agencies there putting reports out. So it's doing nothing to stop the reports that are being produced from the FBI or produced by the state and local report. And we constantly see reports coming public that have these same problems. So, if they could use that initiative to create more of a governance structure over this type of activity, I think it could be something more helpful. I don't think that there's anything particular about DHS that is raising these problems. I think they exist in the field of intelligence collection. And, anytime, the push in cybersecurity as well is this information sharing. Information sharing is seen as the good. Everybody can agree that's important. Well, what the fusion centers and the SARs show, the suspicious activity reporting show, if you're sharing information that's not timely, that's erroneous, that violates people's rights, that information sharing is not valuable. That information sharing is counterproductive and, as the report says, creates white noise that actually impedes good intelligence and good information sharing. So I think there needs to be filters that aren't there, and I would hope that DHS sees that and can improve upon that.
So am I right then, perhaps taking away from that, DHS might provide the infrastructure for sort of some of the reforms you'd like to see, but that the problems predated and probably would exist separate from the agency?
Right. I mean, what I'd like to see is them using their size, number one. I mean, they are largest agency involved in this domestically, so they could certainly play a more of a governance role over particularly this state and local collection at the fusion center level.
Great. When do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit hard to separate DHS from the policy context we're talking about because they emerge from the same events, which is the 9/11 and the response to counterterrorism and its aftermath. And I think that's what's really important to emphasize is the way that affects not only, as Mike said, the activities of DHS, but other counterterrorism policies. Just to pick up on one point that Mike made that I think relates to immigration policy used as a counterterrorism tool is this notion of casting the net really widely as a way of trying to be responsive and active in the counterterrorism arena. And I think some of the policies that we saw, particularly early on after 9/11, but then continued through some of the ones that Mike alluded to in terms of partnerships with state and local law enforcement, suffer from that challenge. And so, if you cast the net widely, then you have the problem of how do you actually sift through that information to find the kind of threats that we face. Plus, you have the issue of targeting whole communities, which was done through some policies. For example, the people who were detained as special immigrant detainees in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 that began in 2001 and continued over the course of the next year or so. Or another example would be NSEERS, the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, which required individuals from particular countries to register and undergo interviews. And it had different components to the program that were shifted slightly over time. But you have these programs that are casting the net widely. They're making people feel targeted just on the basis of their either their religion or their ethnicity or their national origin. And they raise these really deep questions about are they running afoul of basic rights, first and foremost, and also are they actually proving to be effective in tools and ways of identifying threats we find? You see many studies that have been done that look specifically at these questions and at the use of immigration tools in counterterrorism. And one of the themes that emerges so often is that these cast the net widely programs haven't been an effective use of immigration resources, and that much more often it is good old-fashioned roll-up-your-sleeves law enforcement work that is identifying terrorist suspects.
Seth, do you have any thoughts in response to Mike Irwin?
Sure. I mean, I think just generally, one thing that you've seen by bringing DHS and the various agencies together, there's a lot of ways having these various places under one roof and under one ultimate leadership has been helpful. One example that comes to mind is the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, where various parts of the department, the Coast Guard were the first people from America to respond. There was a lot of immigration issues that we were working with USCIS and ICE. FEMA was able to provide assistance based on its disaster recovery. And so having all of those agencies within one, I think really did enable the United States to play a much more robust and active role and coordinated role in responding to the earthquake in Haiti than would have been possible had the agencies been dispersed as they were before the creation of the department. I think with any putting any large organization together, there's obviously costs and benefits. I think, as DHS has matured, we've seen a lot of the benefits of having the places under one roof, having Border Patrol in the same agency as ICE and CIS, or what would have been legacy INS, I think has had a lot of benefits of sort of rationalizing different policies across that, whereas before, in a lot of ways, they were separate. For certain intellectual property enforcement, having ICE and CBP working together with other parts of the department has had a lot of benefits, and I think that's been valuable. On the Fusion Center thing, though, the one thing I would say is, I think Fusion Center is obviously controversial. The report that was generated by the subcommittee of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, the chairman and the ranking member of the full committee, as well as the chairman of the House Committee on Homeland Security, have all repudiated the report and said, they see a lot of very valuable roles for fusion centers, which play an important role beyond just sort of feeding information from state and locals to the federal government, but also distributing information from the federal government to state and locals, coordinating, providing training. And so, as with anything, is there room for improvement? I think there absolutely is, but the department views fusion centers as a very valuable tool, and I think a lot of members of Congress who've been providing oversight of fusion centers for a long time now just reach a very different conclusion from the report. And I think that's the challenge with these activities. that touch on a lot of people, touch on civil rights and civil liberties issues, but also in security. There's often balances and challenges, but I think the department's done a really good job of developing those programs when there's problems, responding to them, and trying to improve the programs over time.
Jamil, picking up on this theme of sort of one large, one agency to rule them all, right? On the cyber front, I mean, I think it might not necessarily have been obvious ab initio that DHS would be the agency that the department given such a prominent role in cybersecurity. Can you say a bit about why you think it ended up that way, and what you think that says about DHS's role, say, compared to the Department of Defense, Department of Justice, and these kinds of issues?
Sure. I mean, I think part of the reason why, at least in the Bush administration, the theory was DHS might be the best place to bring together the government's resources with the private sector was the notion that DHS has some of these connections with the private sector already, having worked with the critical infrastructure and key resources providers to help increase their security in a physical sense. And so the thought being, well, if they're already doing the physical sense, they already have these relationships, perhaps it makes sense to leverage that in the cyber arena. To be sure, I think everybody would agree that DHS doesn't necessarily have the government's lion's share expertise. Certainly, in some ways, U.S. CERT being there, they do have some measure of expertise. But I think everyone understands that NSA, the National Security Agency, has a tremendous amount of expertise in the cyber arena. And the question is, how do you best leverage the intelligence community's capabilities, DoD's capabilities, the FBI's capabilities, and then how do you best share that with the private sector in a way that they can use it and make it efficient? And so, that's a hard question. And I think, both administrations sort of took the same view that perhaps DHS might be the right place to do it. The challenge as it always is with fusion centers and the like is, how does it work in implementation, right? And that's where Congress comes in and looks at it from an oversight perspective and says, look, this process really isn't working very well, and how can we improve that? Could we provide additional authorities? Do we need more aggressive oversight? Do we need to look at budgets? What do we need to do to make this work better? And it's a challenge. And there are different views. In particular in the Senate, I think there are very differing views on who has the best sort of ability to carry this out. I think on the House side, I think our view generally was, look, we need to put the right legal authorities in place to allow this to happen, and then let the process move forward. But there was certainly a more robust debate as to who and how and what. Within the Senate, and in part the regulatory issue, I think caused a lot of challenges. On the one quick note though, on the Fusion Center JTTF's issue, we've been out there. Our committee conducts oversight of DHS, INA, and looks and of FBI and their joint terrorism task forces. And one of the things we've seen when we've gone out to the field and talked to local police departments and Fusion Centers and JTTFs is that one of the challenges when you create different agencies in the government that have similar responsibilities. So FBI has a law enforcement role, investigations of terrorism and the like. DHS has a Homeland Security mission. Well, a lot of times those things overlap, and particularly when it comes to sharing with state and locals, both out of the federal government and back into the federal government. And if you don't provide clear guidance to these folks in the field on who they're supposed to share with and how they're supposed to share, you might have a challenge where the information doesn't get to where it needs to get. And so I think one of the things we've seen is there's a lot of confusion in the field about among state and locals as to who do we talk to? Do we call the Fusion Center? Do we call the JTTF? How do we know when? What do we share? How do we share? It's one of these things that I think a place where Congress and the executive branch can really come together and realize that there's this challenge, and we need to help our partners in the state and local and the private sector and help them better understand, if you come to the federal government, we will find a way to get the information through, but provide them clear guidance as to how that works. And so that's one of the things that I think we're working through with DHS and the Bureau.
So I guess, you mentioned oversight a couple times. I want to sort of maybe shift a bit toward that. One of the sets of concerns that was raised back when the department was created in 2002 was whether there'd be enough checks and balances, right? Whether there'd be enough sort of oversight both from the Hill and also internal. So the Homeland Security Act creates the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties in the Department of Homeland Security. Like all cabinet agencies, DHS has its own inspector general. I guess I want to sort of ask the panelists, what's your view on how both the internal and external oversight functions have worked? Is there adequate oversight of DHS? Could there be more? Have there been, sort of places where there have been successes and failures on the oversight side? I don't know if anyone wants to sort of jump in first. Wendy?
I'll jump in. I think that internal oversight mechanisms are a really important component of the overall accountability architecture that exists for DHS, which of course includes congressional oversight as well as public access to information and the like. And that was really a goal of the bill in 2002. As Steve mentioned, the department has its inspector general, as other agencies do, and that was, of course, going to be very important to see in the agency. But it also created the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, OCRCL. And given the agency's vast powers and the potential for infringing on rights, that was something that advocates in the immigration and civil and human rights community really cared about seeing established. I think in the main, these entities, and I should mention also, and Mike may talk more about this, there's also a chief privacy officer. And so I think, I'm probably more familiar with CRCL, but I think in the main, these entities have done a good job of addressing a wide range of issues and being open to different kinds of concerns that groups representing affected communities may raise. I think OCRCL, the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office, has been effective in engaging immigration advocates and other communities that are affected by DHS policies. And I really think that can be a net gain for DHS to build those relationships, to have those channels of communication. I think one issue is DHS taking full advantage of what that office can contribute on the front end of policy formulation. If you think about these oversight mechanisms, most typically an inspector general looks at issues after the fact, looks at whether there have been problems or abuses that have occurred, and they do a report and produce findings and make recommendations for corrective action. So in that sense, it's a bit preventative because they're recommending corrective actions for the future, but more often than not, they're really looking backward at what has occurred. The Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office can do that as well, but they also have an ability to play a role in identifying issues up front and in trying to address issues and problems before they occur. So, that's something maybe, I don't know, Seth, if you can comment on, but I would hope that is happening in a full and robust way within DHS, and that it's really taking full advantage of not just having that organization do outreach to different groups and affected communities, but really tap that expertise fully in the policy formulation stage.
Yeah, I actually think CRCL is a really important and critical tool at DHS for a lot of the reasons Wendy said. And I think Wendy's exactly right. I mean, I think the difference between CRCL, at least in this administration, and maybe the IG or having pure congressional oversight is this is a person who can be engaged, or this is an office that can be engaged in all stages of the process. And that's certainly been the case here when Margot Schlanger, who was the CRCL officer, is a member of the senior leadership, is very engaged in all of our immigration policies. She was very involved from the front end. So not just sort of doing an audit or sort of doing it at the back end, but having input at the beginning. And because I think that office, among other offices at DHS, had a really good job of engaging with stakeholders on a regular basis. It's not just, okay, we want to do X now, so now we're going to have a stakeholder engagement and try to figure that out. Margot and her office have a good sense of what those issues are when we're discussing them because they have an ongoing dialogue. And I think because of the success of that office, we tried to establish a sort of a similar structure, although different, with creating the Public Advocate's Office at ICE, where we similarly can have someone who's part of their job is regularly engaging with stakeholders, but part of the job is feeding that information back on a regular basis to ICE leadership. And I think that's been a really helpful tool so that people know, if we have an issue, we at least know one person we can get in contact who sort of has this two-way communication. I think that's been very valuable, not just in immigration, but in a lot of other issues, and issues that come up with TSA, issues that come up with the Border Patrol, and issues that come up with FEMA. And it's not just sort of responding to complaints, but also thinking creatively going forward. Are there new policies we can adopt and sort of recommending them? And having someone who's a member of the senior leadership, who has a lot of credibility, who can work with the component heads, with the secretary, I think has had a very, very beneficial effect. I know just from seeing the output of the policies has had a lot of influence on how things are done at the department.
And let me just mention that I agree with Wendy. I think that these offices are valuable, but they're limited in their effectiveness. And Seth is exactly right that the chairman, ranking member of both committees, or just the ranking member of the Senate committee, criticized the Fusion Center report, but I would disagree that they performed oversight. They were supposed to be performing oversight, and maybe the fact that the report shows, and it's heavily documented, and it's mostly quoting DHS internal documents. So the idea that there's something wrong with this report what the report shows is that the oversight isn't adequate. And, this is a perfect example of it, where we published our first report, warning of the dangers, in 2007. We did a follow-up identifying problems that we were finding in 2008. We continued to agitate on the issue with the committees and the agencies all saying there's no problem, there's no problem, there's no problem. Now, it's not just this Senate report. Heritage Foundation has come out with a report criticizing fusion centers. The George Washington University Homeland Security Policy Institute has come out with a report criticizing fusion centers. The Constitution Project has come out with a report. So this shows that that those internal oversight mechanisms are not as effective as they need to be. And another example, which goes to the point of risk-based programs and the guidance that we're talking about putting out. The problem is a lot of the guidance that was going out to the field was awful. And if you look at the anti-Muslim and anti-Arab training that DHS was funding and sponsoring, again, not only a DHS problem, the ACLU exposed, the FBI was producing the same type of materials. Spencer Ackerman at Wired Magazine has exposed a lot of the DoD training. So if this bad training is out there to such a significant degree, why does it take advocacy organizations and investigative reporters to reveal it if these oversight mechanisms are actually working? And I'll give them credit for their response. There's been a general response when we expose these problems, but those are the things that should be discovered internally and put to an end before we have to get involved.
So, Mike, on that note, I guess, what are some of the reforms you'd like to see to bolster that kind of internal oversight function?
Well, with sunlight is always the best disinfectant, and there needs to be a lot more transparency of these programs far beyond DHS. Where like suspicious activity reporting, everybody says, yes, this is great, this is great, this is great, but they can't point to a single instance in which it's actually proven effective in assisting a law enforcement investigation. With fusion centers, the same, that despite all the funding, despite all the rhetoric, when you actually ask them for a fact-based approach for how we identify these problems, the evidence isn't there. And one of the great things DHS did in 2008 when data mining was becoming a rage was fund a report by the National Academies of Science to look at this issue. Is this even scientifically a possibility? And what they came out and said was automated identification of terrorists through data mining or any other known methodology is neither feasible as an objective nor desirable as a goal of technology development efforts. This report basically showed that this methodology, and they also looked at behavioral detection and said these are not effective methodologies that have a huge negative impact on privacy and are not worthwhile without further development. And before you implement these programs, you should do some actual studies to see if this is going to be effective before you go out and violate people's rights. But unfortunately, they're not following their own advice that was given to them, and they move forward with these programs without doing an evaluation. Before you ever get the ACLU involved, is it effective? If it's not effective, don't do it. Don't spend those resources. I'm sure these police departments and these cities and towns would rather have more police officers on the street than 55 flat screen TVs at the Fusion Center. I'm sure they would rather have more teachers in the schools. There's a lot better ways to spend this money, particularly where budgets are tightening. And I'm not saying necessarily take it away from security efforts, but let's put it into security efforts that are effective and address the privacy and civil liberty issues that rise. Because, if a security program is narrowly tailored, the efforts are focused on people who are actually doing harm, right? I mean, for every time that DHS writes a report about a group that's not actually involved in illegal activities, that's a wasted effort that's only going to expand the resources devoted toward chasing something that isn't something that's a threat to anyone. So if we narrow these programs and tailor them to focus where there is evidence of wrongdoing, which was the standard that I as an FBI agent operated under before 2001, that actually makes them more effective by taking a lot of this stuff that wastes everybody's time, wastes everybody's money, and harms people's privacy, but doesn't actually improve security.
So I guess, Jamil, then a question for you. I mean, if there are concerns from the civil liberties groups, from the human rights groups, that there isn't enough, that the internal oversight checks aren't adequate. Do you think that makes it more of an imperative for the folks on the Hill with oversight authority over DHS to be more active? Do you think that Congress has been sufficiently active in its oversight of DHS? How does the internal and external oversight function sort of relate to each other?
I think absolutely. If internal oversight's a challenge, external oversight's necessary. And Congress does an aggressive job of looking at the Department of Homeland Security. It varies across the committees. Different committees have different jurisdictions. DHS being a large entity has a number of committees that conduct oversight. You might think that it's simply the Homeland Security Committee. It's not. There's a lot of committees that have some oversight responsibility. I know DHS has its own concerns about how many committees it reports to. That in part is a product of it being such a large agency and have such a diverse set of portfolios and an expanding set of portfolios we see with cybersecurity and other things being added on as time goes along. But I do think Congress, in its own way, does a very aggressive job of conducting oversight. And when these issues do come up, as you see with the Fusion Center report, as we've done in our oversight in the cybersecurity arena, INA, the Fusion Centers, JTTFs, it's always an ongoing process. And having I don't have a real sense of how it is today with respect to the policy development process, but certainly when in the Bush administration, CRCL and the Chief Privacy Officer were extremely involved in the policy development process. They were very active, very robust in their efforts to look out for these issues, spot them ahead of time before the policy was developed and implemented, and try to get ahead of that. And you had I think a very strong effort there. Another entity that does some of that responsibility is the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, an outside entity created in statute. Unfortunately, until fairly recently, didn't even have appointees to the board in this administration. Only recently got a full complement of appointees, and even now the Senate hasn't confirmed the chairperson yet of the having recently confirmed 4 members of the PCLOB. So there are these challenges, and it's hard to figure out how much of it is necessary internal oversight, how much of it needs to be external, how much needs to be Congress, how much needs to be external within the executive branch. But there are a lot of these mechanisms in place, and the key is to making sure that they work and they work efficiently, and that they're at the same time achieving the mission, right? So what you don't want is oversight that's simply oversight for oversight's sake. You want good, aggressive oversight, but oversight that moves the ball forward on the mission, and in a time of declining budgets, right? And everyone understands that's what it is. We have to do things more efficiently, more effectively, and in order to ensure that privacy and civil liberties are protected adequately, you want to do them in the most narrowly tailored way possible, and that's an important thing for everyone to keep in mind.
So shifting away a bit from the privacy civil liberties issues, which I suspect will come back up during the audience Q&A, let me also ask a question about federalism. Because it seems like one of the really interesting things about the last 10 years has been the shift toward much more federal involvement in not necessarily national security issues, which were always obviously the problems of the federal government, but also sort of ordinary disaster recovery and response. Certainly after the problems with Katrina, sort of shoring up FEMA's role. That's actually probably a really bad pun. And I guess one of the questions for the panelists is has this been, in your view, a net positive development, that there's much more of a federal role? Mike, you mentioned, the sort of local and state governments getting, lots of money for TVs when they might be able to use it for other things. Is one of the hallmarks, one of the lessons of the last 10 years, the expanding federal role in things that we might used to have thought of as everyday law enforcement, and perhaps a usurping of state and local law enforcement? If so, is that a net positive? Is it a negative? Is it something to keep our eyes on?
I think it's still an open question because there hasn't been enough public oversight. Maybe behind closed doors it's being done, but I think part of the problem is we don't see it. And going back to the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, while we have a positive, I think, relationship with them, part of the issue is that they don't publicize what they do afterwards. So it's very disheartening to know, okay, I made a complaint, but what happened? Who knows? And with all these different issues, it's again that sort of moving forward into new territory without the at least the public evaluations of whether these are actually effective methodologies, where they're making it better, whether there is a negative impact, both to budgets and to more my concern, privacy and civil liberties.
I think in the immigration area, with respect to your question about federalism, the trend is really in the other direction. Immigration law has always been the province of the federal government, and what we have seen has been a growing role of state and local law enforcement, with concerns being raised from lots of different quarters, from affected communities, from immigrant advocacy groups,
from Justice Kennedy,
from law enforcement officials. Yeah, so it plays out in terms of the kinds of collaborative programs that Mike was describing in other counterterrorism areas, but in the immigration area, there are things like secure communities and 287G agreements where the federal government is partnering with state and local law enforcement. But I think, as most people know, some of the real difficulties in this area are that, immigration status is a very complicated matter, and there are many different forms of status and documentation that shows that, and it's not a simple thing to have people wade into, and it does raise all these concerns about that, as well as relationships between police and their local communities. How do victims of crime have a comfort level in coming forward to their local law enforcement when they may be involved in immigration enforcement? There's a lot of really difficult issues, which is why you hear from law enforcement about this, as well as communities. But as you alluded to, nowhere has this trend been more present than with respect to the Arizona immigration law, SB 1070, which was heard by the Supreme Court, where it struck down 3 of the 4 provisions on federalism grounds, but the 4th one, it did not want to strike down on a facial challenge, although it left open to hearing it later, and that's the one that is the so-called racial profiling provision, which has local law enforcement inquiring about a person's status if they appear to be appear to be an immigrant. And so this issue, I think, remains with us and will be an enormously challenging one going forward.
Although, it did certainly seem from Justice Kennedy's opinion in Arizona that the court was skeptical that provision would survive without very, very careful tailoring on remand. But Seth, sorry.
No. So, I think, the department conducted the first quadrennial Homeland Security review in 2010, and, what it defined, I think, is important is, thinking of the Homeland Security enterprise of consisting not just of DHS, certainly, because there's plenty of other federal agencies that play a role, and not just the federal government, but that, Homeland Security requires the participation of federal government, state, local, and tribal governments, and the private sector, and think of it in that way. And I think it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. FEMA is a great example. I think we saw in the response to Sandy how important the role of FEMA is for affected communities and how much progress has been made over the last 4 years. I think FEMA played a really important role, and it's working. It played an important role, and that role works because it works with state and local governments. It doesn't come in and sort of take over, but it applies its expertise, and it had a really important effect. And I think we saw that from the response from individuals in the affected communities and from state and local officials. In immigration, I think Wendy's right that there has been more of a role of how can we figure out how to work with state and local officials in a way that makes sense. But one thing that I think is critical and that has been DHS's position has been, in immigration, the federal government sort of sets the priorities, sets the policies, is in charge, but there's a way for state and local governments to assist, not in setting immigration policy, but in helping the federal government execute its policy and its priorities. And the SB 1070 case is a good example. That the Justice Department was suing on behalf of DHS and the State Department, and DHS played a very active role because it views the balance between state and local governments and the federal government in the immigration realm as something that's really important and needs clear definition. That being said, I think we do think there's an important role for state and local law enforcement officials to play when it's defined, when it's responsive to the federal government's policies and priorities. And the only way for us to, in our view, to effectuate our ability to prioritize who we're going to remove, prioritizing criminals and other threats, is by working with some of these important partnerships, including secure communities. So I think these are all sort of, as with all DHS issues, intersect with a lot of different things. But I think, as a general matter, for Homeland Security to really work, it really does need a partnership among all levels of government and the private sector.
I think, and we often, sitting in Washington, D.C. and, working on Capitol Hill or serving the executive branch, we all sort of, I think, have the sense that the federal government's what it's all about. But, going back to first principles, the federal government was always created as an entity of limited powers, right? And so the goal should always be in our entire, sort of policy process to recognize that and push as much authority and responsibility down to states and locals as much as possible, in part because they're the closest to the people they serve. Right? They're the ones most in touch with the communities. They're the ones there every day. Now, there are important value adds that the federal government provides, and the framers of the Constitution recognize that. Right? National security is one of those areas. And then specifically in the counterterrorism area, we have to realize that the reality is this is a collaborative process. Right? The federal government can't do it all on its own. It certainly needs the state and locals and needs to collaborate with them. And we need clear guidance on how that works. But at the end of the day, the priority should be, as much authority as possible should devolve down to state and local government, recognizing the important role in unique areas the federal government plays.
So we're about to. I have one more question before we turn to the audience Q&A part of it. I guess it's sort of where do we go from here? So we've the president's just been reelected. We've got presumably 4 more years of this administration. What should be the priorities for the Department of Homeland Security for the next 4 years, for the next 10 years? I mean, if you could pick 1 or 2 things to really sort of harp on as the big picture items, what should they be and why? Mike, do you want to go first?
Well, in the intelligence area, I mean, I think I'd be happier if I saw a lot of DHS acceptance of the criticism as something that they have to address and use this as an opportunity to pivot and to move toward a more evidence-based and scientific approach to counterterrorism and Homeland Security in general, and start focusing on finding programs that actually work and funding and putting resources into those programs. I mean, hopefully this becomes a time where we can look at all these programs, not just DHS, but across the board, because there is this move to sort of break down the barriers of information sharing. What we're forgetting is that there are a lot of good reasons for those rules. I mean, one of the reasons that we don't want the military involved in cybersecurity is that to Americans, the idea of the U.S. military spying on Americans is abhorrent. And we want the military out of that kind of activity. And, with the history of the NSA warrantless wiretapping program to boot, that, the public's ability to have strong oversight of military agencies is much reduced. So we want that being done at a civilian agency, where state and local entities are involved. I totally agree with Jamil that and in my discussions with DHS and the FBI, I often find the state and locals are on my side because they realize that pushing these standards down is going to create more problems for them in the local communities. And they want the high standards, one, because they work better. They give them the information they need without getting them into trouble by spying on people they shouldn't, but also because it's good for their relationship with the communities they serve. And that's what I think the federal government often misses, is that this is not just a security issue. You're serving a community, and you need to be responsive to their concerns. So when reports come out that are critical, rather than just denouncing them as the committee chairman did, maybe just saying, okay, this is valuable information we can use to make our program much better. And it's going to be putting in guidelines in place and making sure there's enough independent oversight so that when problems are identified, they can be corrected.
I think it will be important to see much more carefully considered policies at the intersection of immigration and national security, much along the lines of what Mike said. And we would not want to see programs that, again, are really broad in their application, that raise questions about their discriminatory nature, that subject a set of people to special policies that violate their basic rights and the like. And even though, to get to examples I gave, like the special immigrant detentions right after 9/11, or NSEERS, which I should note was ended by DHS in April of 2011, we wouldn't want to see policies like that. Even though they're no longer in place, we wouldn't want to see them be dusted off the shelf and used again if there were a perceived need. We'd want to see much more targeted, thoughtful policies that, as we've alluded to, really take a careful look at what's effective and what upholds basic rights. In the immigration area, I think we certainly, as I said, I think this is a different kind of question with respect to where we go, because we certainly wouldn't want to see 50 different state immigration policies, and I think the Supreme Court was very clear about that in what it said to Arizona about this being an area of primary federal activity. So the question then is, and we wouldn't want to see that in part because of some of the very serious concerns about laws like Arizona's that I alluded to before. So where do we go from here? And I think, as everyone knows, there is now a really renewed push for immigration reform. It's been long stalled. There's been unwillingness to tackle it, despite agreement all around that there needs to be reform. Now is the time to seize the moment. And the President has made clear that this will be a priority for the administration. And that'll be led by the White House, but of course DHS will have a role to play in that. I think it's clear that there's strong support for immigration reform and for creating a path to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented persons in the country. So I think that will probably be the most significant development, on the horizon in the area of immigration.
So, I think, the next 4 years are going to require to continue to mature the agency. As I mentioned at the beginning, 10 years is not very long. We've learned a lot of lessons, and I think we need to continue to apply them, both, internally and in our interactions with others. I think there are a few key sort of policy areas that I think will likely require congressional action, but I think would be important. Cybersecurity is a really important one. I think immigration is another important one. The President and the Secretary have long been clear that they think the current legal system is broken. We need to create a 21st century immigration system, and I think that's something obviously that we welcome. I just think continue to build on the progress we've made in a lot of fronts at FEMA, at CBP, at TSA, with immigration, to continue to build on those things. I think one thing that's true, I think, of all agencies, but particularly an agency as new as DHS, is we're constantly looking for ways to improve the programs we have, and I think we made a lot of improvements over the last 4 years, and I think there is room to continue to build upon these.
I'll just talk on the one for specific area of cybersecurity. I think one of the challenges, the House back in April passed this bipartisan bill that provided for information sharing authorities. The administration has a proposal that, while has important differences, is similar in many ways. Both the Senate bills that are being considered on cybersecurity have also similar information sharing proposals. To be sure, there are important differences, but in the main, there are largely of a piece. And I think it's our sense that these things can be reconciled, and that there can be a path forward on this question of information sharing in a way that adequately protects privacy and civil liberties, but still gets the mission done, and does it in a way where you don't have the federal government sitting on the network trying to actually protect the private sector, rather enabling the private sector to defend itself. Now, the real challenge has been this question of how do you deal with this regulatory issue, and it's unfortunate that at this point, it appears that we've lost an opportunity to really take what everybody agrees is a consensus, position, move the ball forward, get the president a bill he can sign, and I think it's unfortunate because I think we've missed a unique opportunity. And the challenge, of course, with the issuance of an executive order, as the administration all too well knows, and admits it can't do everything, and it can't do a lot of what needs to be done, particularly in the information sharing arena. And in some ways, the issuance of an executive order simply sucks the air out of any motivation to move the legislative process forward. I think Congress will continue to look at this issue, but I think the key here has got to be, to be sure the regulatory question is an important one, but it's one that we ought not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and miss the opportunity, the unique opportunity to get a consensus information sharing bipartisan bicameral bill that adequately protects privacy and civil liberties while ensuring that we can move the ball forward on cybersecurity. Because the truth is, today we are under attack. Our intellectual property is being sucked out of our economy on a tremendous basis, primarily by China, and the administration, the Secretary of Defense recently talked about the actual destructive attacks that have taken place against some foreign companies, some foreign private sector companies, and the recent attacks against the U.S. financial sector. We are at a time of crisis, and the last thing you want to do is legislate in a time of real crisis, right? And crisis makes for bad legislation. We have a unique opportunity. We ought to act now, and I think we're looking to the White House and the Senate for some leadership on this.
So crisis like 9/11 attacks.
No, that's exactly but the truth is if you have the opportunity to step back and look at the law and make a good consensus piece of legislation, that's the right way to do it. Sometimes you have to act in a time of crisis. But when you know there's a problem coming and you see it on the horizon and you don't take action, or you do things where you know it might prevent the process from moving forward as aggressive as it might, it's unfortunate. We have a unique opportunity. We have to take advantage of it.
So we've got some time for audience questions. As is the standard at ACS events, we'd like to give first preference to members of the press.
I'm Alex Daniels from the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. I'd like to hear from the panel about whether FEMA would work better if it were taken out of DHS or any other particular agencies. Is this the time to split some of these agencies out?
Well, I mean, so our perspective is no. We think FEMA works extremely well in the department. And I certainly think FEMA's record in the last 4 years, including in its response to Hurricane Sandy, sort of speaks for itself. I think there's a lot of advantages to having agency devoted to disaster response and resilience in the same department as other agencies that are working on related issues. You can leverage that expertise and experience, and I think it's proven to work in our view over the last 4 years.
So can I put back on that a little? I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. The question is there any concern that the one place where there might be tension is many of the agency's functions are sort of targeted toward national security protection from man-made threats, right? Whereas FEMA actually is dual-hatted insofar as it's responsible for both natural and artificial disasters. Is there any concern that there's a bit of a creep between the two because you've got FEMA sort of working so closely with agencies that are dealing with more sort of man-made threats?
I don't think so. I think it's just the opposite, that people that will leverage the experience. I mean, there are obviously significant differences between natural disasters and man-made threats, but in terms of how you respond, how you work with local communities, state and local governments, individuals who lose a house, lose a car, need response, a lot of that is very similar. And having that sort of aligned and being able to leverage that experience, you don't have to reinvented the wheel at one agency, another agency, I think really helps. And having that under one cabinet secretary who sort of has all these things and can sort of help cross-pollinate across different agencies also really helps. And I think we've seen when there is an emergency like Sandy or other things, if FEMA administrators out there working it, there's not a problem of sort of he's buried or he can't do his job. And I think in the other ways, there's just a lot of cross-pollination. Craig King, the agency administrator, has done an amazing job and has just great insights and experience, and that helps inform other activities, which I think would be more difficult with agencies.
We have other media questions?
Hi, Dan Frumpkin from the Huffington Post. I wanted to ask the panel and the moderator in particular, the estimates that since 9/11 we spent an extra $500 billion on Homeland Security that we wouldn't have otherwise. How much of that was well spent? How much of that was poorly spent? And do you think maybe it's time to decentralize DHS?
Well, I can certainly say that, having this cost estimate at DHS of fusion centers somewhere between $289 million and $1.4 billion shows that we don't know how some of that money is being spent. So it's hard to say whether it's being spent well if we don't know how it's being spent. But I don't think that is a problem unique to DHS. DOJ funds the fusion centers, who knows, maybe to the same degree. FBI participates in fusion centers just as DHS analysts do. So I think that your question, looking broader over all these campaigns, I think is exactly appropriate, that we need to do that type of analysis, and it's really a shame that it's taken that long. The best sort of factual argument for the success of these programs is, well, something as bad as 9/11 hasn't happened again, so therefore it must be working, which I always say, well, you could have made that same argument on September 10th, 2001. It must be working. And we found out the hard way it wasn't. So we shouldn't have to wait to find out the hard way that these programs aren't working. You know, let's do a real thorough analysis of all of the programs, top to bottom. You know, look at the intelligence community writ large. You know, this National Academies of Science report came out in 2008 saying that this automated data mining is not feasible in this area, not scientifically feasible. And yet we have NCTC moving to big data, you know, where they've changed their guidelines so they can suck in entire databases regardless of the U.S. person information involved. So we have them moving in a way that the science tells us isn't going to be effective. It's going to be very expensive. It's going to have a huge negative impact on Americans' privacy. And there's no analysis of whether this is actually an effective methodology. So it's long overdue.
I mean, I would just add that I think what we want to see, as I alluded to earlier, were approaches that are much more targeted and based on a careful analysis of the need, of effectiveness, and of policies that uphold our values and our basic rights and treat people fairly and humanely. And that it's really important, as you suggest, to be thinking about this in the context of the fiscal environment, and that resources are used wisely. And it also seems timely 10 years on to look at these various policies and ensure that they're effective. But I would agree with Mike that I think it's really honing in on the overall policy context and the approaches to policy that I think is most important, because you see those cutting across different agencies. That's really the central question in play.
You know, I mean, the only thing I would just say is, you know, I mean, we feel like, you know, this obviously is a tighter fiscal climate for everyone. You know, we feel like, you know, we defend our LAs every year with our budget hearings with the Secretary every year. It's 4 budget hearings, 2.5 in the Senate. You know, so every year we feel like the budget undergoes a pretty careful review. There's always, you know, more to be done, but I don't think it's just, we certainly don't feel, and I think it's not fair to say, you know, there's just at least anymore, that there's just a blank check given to DHS and they can just spend however it wants. You know, we defend, you know, we review our programs and defend our programs every year when we're putting together our budget. That's not to say there aren't improvements that can still be made, and programs that can be changed or adjusted. But, you know, I think every federal agency across the federal government these days pays really careful attention to how it spends money and tries to, you know, spend it in the most efficient way possible. In huge organizations, there's always going to be problems and maybe things that you don't catch, but I think there is a very careful attention paid to the fiscal environment for us and for all agencies across the federal government.
I mean, you know, I mean, Congress will obviously, as we take a hard look at the deficit and make the cuts that are necessary in order to get our budget balanced again and get our economy back on strong footing. Congress will continue to take an aggressive look at all agencies' budget, and DHS is no exception to that. You know, the government can and should do things more efficiently. It can and should spend money better. It should spend on effective programs, not ineffective programs. And it's partly, in large part, it's Congress's role to make sure that happens. And I think that Congress plans to do that under the leadership of the Speaker and in the House. And I think that's the plan going forward.
Hey, I'm just the moderator. You know, I think I'll just add. I mean, I agree. I don't have much to contribute beyond what's been said. I'll just say I think part of the question isn't just the money, but the sort of the shifts in law, right? The substantive legal shifts that have actually taken place as part of this regime over the past 10 years. So, you know, we talked about the privacy oversight. We talked about the Office of Rights and Civil Liberties. We haven't spent enough time on this panel talking about the ways in which the actual substance of our civil liberties protections in federal law have themselves been changed in the last 10 years. And I think it's really remarkable. I mean, you know, the most remarkable thing about the Petraeus affair, right, is I think how much it awoke, it sort of opened a lot of people's eyes to just how much authority the government has when it comes to ordinary civil liberties, and the extent to which a lot of pre-existing privacy protections were relaxed by Congress over the past 10 years. So, you know, to my mind, if we're going to have a conversation about cost, it's not necessarily just financial cost. It's also, you know, the cost of protections that used to exist that for various reasons don't anymore. But I'll put my monitor hat back on now and say, next question.
Hi, David Silverberg, Homeland Security Today. On, I guess, a more fun side, since it looks like Secretary Napolitano may be leaving, two names that have been floated are Thad Allen and Joseph Lieberman. Anybody have anyone they want to nominate or speculate about who would make a good next Secretary of Homeland Security?
I'll nominate Seth. I think that may be all we get, right?
Yeah.
Maybe after the panel's over, we could talk offline about thoughts on that topic. But why don't we open up to sort of more general audience questions now? So I know there are a bunch of hands. Why don't we start in the back corner?
Hi, we've talked about security and the large focus, obvious focus that DHS needs to have in security, but also the very centralized role and the many agencies that that went into DHS. Does the kind of hyper focus on security detract from, in any way, like a careful evaluation of policy and being able to change and adapt to, I guess, the need for new policies, including especially on immigration? And I'm thinking of fraud specifically. I don't know if that's too broad of a question, but.
No, I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think there's a few different spots. One is, I mean, I think people define security in different ways, and I think as in QHSR and other things have been, security is a pretty broad term. But in terms of being, nimble enough to respond, I feel like the last 4 years show that it's very possible to respond pretty effectively. Over the last 4 years, there's been no legislative change or meaningful legislative change, but the department's adopted a lot of policies, either policies or regulations to try to address what we thought were shortcomings in the immigration system. So we've adopted these civil enforcement priorities. We implemented deferred action for childhood arrivals process. We've changed how we do worksite enforcement. We are promulgating a regulation for people who have unlawful presence who need a waiver before they can adjust status. They can get a provisional waiver in the United States. We are promulgating regulations to address a number of different issues. So I feel like there has been that. I mean, one advantage of having, I think, a big department is it gives the component heads, the heads of ICE, USCIS, CBP, they have a lot of freedom to sort of manage their agencies, but with the oversight of someone, the secretary and deputy secretary, overseeing to make sure there is coordination between the two. And so I think in a lot of ways, having that has been advantageous. On the fraud point, I think there's two dynamics. One is that the secretary and the director of USCIS take fraud extremely seriously, and I think the reason we can do some of these policies is because we've established credibility that we take fraud very seriously. We go after it when it's there because we need to maintain the integrity of the system, and we think that's very important. And I think as there's been sort of more sort of technological developments, it's also intersected with now it's much easier to detect fraud than it was maybe back when Wendy was at INS or something, when a lot more of the stuff was paper-based, and so it's harder to see. So I think it's a combination of both of there's a very strong attention to fraud to maintain integrity of the system, and it has actually become somewhat easier to detect fraud just because of the way the system is.
Hi, Professor Otto Hetzel. Got actually an article on fusion centers with one of the ABA Press. But what I really wanted to ask today is really probably directed more towards Mr. Jaffer, which is none of you have really discussed a very substantial amount of the DHS budget that goes to state and local governments. And it's gone in different kind of formulas or different kind of approaches. But I think Michael's point is very correct. I have never seen anything other than GAO reports, a few Inspector General reports about the effectiveness and use of the funds. And last time I gave a presentation on this, I said, it is going to come to your door sooner or later, talking to a lot of people in that area, that you're going to have to justify what you're doing. And that to me is such an open area for analysis by the Hill. And I'm surprised that it hasn't been done, because if you want to talk about fusion centers, it's just a drop in the bucket compared to these other funds. So do you have any plans to deal with that area?
I think in large part, a lot of the funds you're talking about are largely fall within the oversight of the Homeland Security Committee. I can certainly say, from the Intelligence Committee's perspective, we take a hard look at budgets, a very hard look at budgets, and are always looking to find efficiencies. and help agencies to operate more effectively and more efficiently. Obviously, a lot of our work is in the classified realm, and so it's hard to talk about that. But I can tell you that the bulk of the funds you're talking about, state and local funding that comes from DHS in the form of grants or other types of programs, are areas that I think the Homeland Security Committee is sort of best positioned to look at. Just not what we do, unfortunately.
And I think part of it is the structure. I mean, it's a little different from the Intelligence Committee working federal intelligence agencies to Congress providing money to state and local authorities. Of course, part of the way our system works is that they want to bring home something to show that, their representation is effective and working. So, it's hard to criticize state and local governments and state and local law enforcement. You want them on your side all the time. So this becomes just a big trough of money. And I think that's one of the greatest things about the report is it shows how opaque that is, that even when the committee correctly did start doing that oversight, its ability to find what money was going where was impossible. And that's a huge part of the problem, and I think it certainly shows that this needs to be shorn up, because, if we find a fusion center or some other component that's doing something wrong, if you can't shut off the money, you can't stop it. And if you can't find what money is going there, you can't stop it. So, that, if nothing else comes out of the report but that, I think it will do some good, because I think it is the sort of free money. Well, we might as well do intelligence work. Well, what's intelligence work? We're getting no guidance, so let's start spying on the local activists. Seems to be what's happening.
I'm Bert Wise. I'm a pro bono private advocate, but for more than a quarter of a century I did oversight of national security and civil liberties in the Senate, House, and White House. And Jamil's last comment before the question made me a little nervous with regard to pushing as much as we can down to the local level. I know that Mike said some local law enforcement people would like more standards, and there may be some enlightened ones, but there are thousands of state, local, county law enforcement. As far back as 35 years ago in the Church Committee, we found situations where the CIA and FBI, where there were very few restrictions then before the Attorney General's guidelines, sometimes encouraged local law enforcement people to get information that even then they felt a little nervous about getting. And I've seen since 9/11 some troublesome indications of situations where federal agencies are using local law enforcement to get information that under current restrictions they don't feel they can get, or activities they don't feel they can undertake. And to go a bit afield, in Title VI of the Civil Rights Law now, any local agency getting federal money in any aspect has to comply with non-discrimination laws in all of their activities. And I'm wondering, even though you're the moderator, what Stephen or Mike think about the idea of saying that any law enforcement agency that gets any federal money has to comply with the same regulations and limitations to protect civil liberties that now apply to the FBI and other federal agencies.
Absolutely. I think that's a good idea where the federal rules are stronger than the state and local. What we're finding in a lot of cases is that state and local laws, regulations, policies are much narrower, and what we have by the creation of these multi-jurisdictional units, whether they're joint terrorism task forces or fusion centers, is that the multi-jurisdictional aspect of it creates an initiative to find the lowest level of regulatory effect. So if I'm in a state where my state laws protect privacy better than the federal government, I give the assignment to the FBI agent sitting next to me whose regulations are watered down to where they need no criminal predicate or no predicate at all, no factual predicate in order to start initiating investigations. So you're exactly right, and there is this federal, part of the Fusion Center initiative is pushing down to the state and local law enforcement and encouraging them to violate the rules. I mean, one of the things that came out of that era you're talking about was a federal regulation, 28 CFR Part 23. It has that cute name that limited what information state and local law enforcement could put into shared intelligence information systems, so that we could make sure that it was functioned on a criminal predicate, reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, and had rules for how it was collected and shared. And the whole purpose of the suspicious activity reporting program appears to be to circumvent that regulation. And we engaged with the information sharing environment to try to uphold those standards, but there is a constant push to say this is a system where you can collect innocuous information, and again, there's very little public information about what is out there, but the public information shows that there is a strong racial disparity in what's being collected and who's being stopped and interrogated. And we have many cases of people's rights being violated because of these policies. So that is a huge problem.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I'll just sort of underscore the point that it assumes federal law is more protective of civil liberties than state law, which I think is unfortunately increasingly not the case. I'm sure we could actually keep going on with questions, but we've reached the end of our time. So please join me in thanking our panelists for thank you all for coming. Thanks to ACS and the Open Society Foundations, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.